Hi everyone, welcome to Career Journey Podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Essalat, and today's episode features Meredith Essalat, and she is a K-8 school principal in San Francisco, California, and recently the author of The Overly Honest Teacher, Parenting Advice from the Classroom, which was released back in October 2020, and you can find it on Amazon, Bookshop, wherever you purchase books. And this episode was a really fun ride in learning all about how to become a teacher. Obviously, she started as a teacher before becoming a school principal. We talked about how she did teacher shadowing, all of that. Another really cool thing about Meredith's career, there was a few. First was she kind of happened into part of her career because her boss, while she was in college, took a maternity leave and prompted her to kind of rush into a position that just transformed everything she wanted to do with her career, which really demonstrates the power of how a flash circumstance that you're not even expecting can change your trajectory. Another really exciting thing about her career was how she had to do a really long commute. She had to fly every day for work almost, or at least every week, while her and her family lived in completely different states, which is just astronomical and amazing. And during that long commute on that plane is when she wrote her book, The Overly Honest Teacher. And what's really cool about her writing this book is she didn't start out to write a book. She kind of just started writing all these things that were coming to her mind that she felt she needed to get out, and they formed themselves into a book, which, as somebody who's writing a book, I wish it was that easy of a process. And so it's really exciting conversation. If you're interested in teaching at all, writing, if you have children and you're trying to figure out how to communicate with their teacher, then this episode has everything covered for you. So without further ado, please enjoy Meredith Essalat. Hey everyone, welcome to the Career Journey Podcast, where we explore exciting careers and how to get them from the people who've lived it. I'm your host, Dr. Brittany Essalat. Thank you for tuning in and enjoy. Hi Meredith, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So we usually get started with just a basic question of, did you have any idea or did you have dreams of what you wanted to be when you were a child?
Not doing what I'm doing now. I think every child at some point, well, I won't generalize, but a lot of kids play teacher growing up. You know, you're teaching your stuffed animals or whatever. My little brother was my victim at the time. But no, when I started going through adolescence, my mom always said that I would make a great teacher. And I had aspirations to be a writer, to move to New York, and to really pursue journalism. Though teaching didn't really come onto my radar for a number of years after college, but organically it all came about, and I definitely feel now like I'm where I was meant to be.
Yeah. And so how did you decide you wanted to go to college and do journalism? Did you go to major in journalism at all, or?
I did. Yes, I went to a local liberal arts college here in the San Francisco Bay Area, which had an amazing mass communications program. And I started writing for our campus newspaper and really focused less on broadcast journalism and more on print because I loved to write. It was always a hobby of mine growing up. And so that was really where I got my footing and my foundation in journalism. And I still use so many of those principles today. So Absolutely. It is completely applicable. Yeah.
And were you at all nervous? So my sister majored in mass communication journalism and was specific in print. She even went in and, worked at a couple newspapers and ended up transitioning out of that career because it was changing and evolving. And it was, at that time, it was kind of disappearing in its former form. Did that make you nervous at all? Did that come into play in your decisions?
Not necessarily to leave it. It was more that opportunities came in my pathway that took my love of writing and I could use it, but I could also develop these other skill sets and passions that I didn't even know I had. Now, when I look back on it, I see that the evolution of print journalism continues to evolve.
Yeah.
But I actually think that the pendulum, much like it does in so many industries, is going to end up swinging back a bit. I think that more and more we're craving the tangible again.
Right.
I think that so much there's a disconnect when things are on a screen and online, and we really want to feel the paper in our hands. That's such a different experience for my students especially, but for adults as well. So I'm hopeful that we're gonna come back towards the center a bit on it.
Definitely, and especially if it's the type of content that doesn't need that immediate, right? Like breaking news, we like to get on our phones now because we can get it so fast. But tons of the content, I mean, blog posts, websites, all of those things are so prolific, and you don't really need them on the screen. You can definitely have that in kind of that tangible form.
Definitely, yes.
And so after majoring in mass communications journalism, what did you do next?
So I was working on campus in student activities and student leadership. I was actually a commuter student, so the college really tapped into me to bring a different perspective to the typical dorm student. And when I was graduating, my boss at the time, who was Dean of Student Life, was going out on maternity leave. So I was given the opportunity to assume that role on an interim basis, which I did. And
That's
so
nice.
it was great. No, the timing was perfect. I was really grateful for it. And it really helped me broaden my ability to plan and execute large scale events. I really started to tap into my propensity for developing student leadership and helping students navigate kind of, at that point, it was the perils of the collegiate life and transitioning into that new world. But again, as an educator now in the elementary world, I still use so many of those principles to help my students find their voices. So yeah, so no, I transitioned into that. And when my boss came back, because I had been working in student life, I started to get into some collegiate fundraising and moved into more of the development department on campus. So again, I started moving in a different direction, but it was just more like life opening these doors for me, and I really leaned into it.
And honestly, that's one of the reasons I started this podcast, was how much these random events, like the fact that your boss went on maternity leave, changed your career trajectory in a little ways. And I think sometimes when I was young, I didn't realize how much those life things would impact my career decisions. I thought I formulate them, I make these career decisions. And then you realize, oh, somebody goes on maternity leave, you get this opportunity, it changes what you want to do. And so I really like hearing that multiple kind of life events helped navigate your direction.
I would not be where I am currently if not for that opportunity right out of college. Because again, I wanted to write, I wanted to move to New York, and that would have just totally taken me on a different path. Not to say it would have been a better or worse one, but it's just so interesting to look back now. And especially for myself, who tends to be kind of the micromanager and type A, and I'm gonna have it all in this line. I'm proud of myself for embracing the organicness.
Yes, I totally can identify with that.
Yeah.
All right, and then so where did you go after that job?
So I was in touch, I was on the alumni board at my former alma mater, and turned out that there was going to be an opening in their development department for an alumni relations coordinator and a development assistant. And so it was a perfect transition. I got to move into more of the secondary schools and work in alumni relations, again, writing a lot for marketing and for publicity, but also got to start to understand grant writing, specifically for the education sector. And I went on the journey of getting my teaching credential because I wanted to be a better fundraiser. I wanted to understand education and pedagogy so that when I reached out to foundations or to donor opportunities, I could understand what made our school unique and differentiate ourselves from others. So again, it was more to support this journey in fundraising that I even went further to get my teaching credential.
That's really nice. I actually just heard somebody ask the other day, should administration and staff at universities at least be forced to teach every once in a while so that they have their pulse still on that education? And so it's nice that you took that initiative and kind of blending those two different parts of the kind of academic experience.
Well, to that question, I say a resounding yes.
Yeah.
Every administrator needs to have an understanding of what happens in the inner workings of a classroom environment 200%.
Yep. Honestly, and I think us teachers should understand how administration works sometimes as well, because it seems so complicated. I'm amazed at what they do.
It's like drinking out of a fire hose 24/7.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you went to get your teaching credential in order to help you with fundraising. How long did you stay in fundraising after that?
So unfortunately, about a year in, our whole department was disbanded. The school was going in a different direction. And so my job was eliminated. But as fate would have it, it was right when I was about to go into student teaching.
Okay.
Which was going to pull me out of my office responsibilities a bit anyway. So again, another door opened with that, and I started student teaching in a third grade classroom that fall.
Okay. And then what was that experience like? It must have been a complete, or seemingly a complete 180, right? Going into a third grade classroom after doing fundraising and more behind the scenes?
Yes, except an elementary classroom is very much akin to the college environment in a lot of ways, in terms of just mayhem and hijinks and all of that. So in those spaces, it wasn't so different. But yes, to all of a sudden be immersed in a classroom of, 30-some 8-year-olds versus interacting with alumni, who are well into their adult years, that part was a big change, but a great one, because it just was this energy overload that I think I had always been craving. Mm-hmm. And so that part just really filled my bucket.
And can you walk through what student teaching is like? Obviously, you're not the main teacher, right? You're the student teacher. So for those who are interested in teaching but don't know exactly how that field works yet, what is student teaching? What does it look like?
Yeah, no, so I know that different states and even different districts have differing versions of it, but basically you go in as support to the lead teacher. So that, I would say, that's about a third of it. A third of it is where you are given autonomy over certain parts of the curriculum to be able to practice lesson planning and classroom management and, behavioral strategies and the like. And then the other third is really the chance to observe a tenured teacher in their element and to really be able to have moments, because once you're in a classroom of your own, having that time for self-reflection in the moment is just not available. Yes. But as a student teacher, you can really sit back and be like, wow, I see how they approach this small group situation, or my goodness, that is how you handle a behavioral situation that could otherwise derail a classroom environment. So it's kind of broken down into thirds. In my experience, it was a full-time job. And so I was actually on an hourly stipend so that I could do it full-time and not necessarily have to have a second job to support myself during those times.
Nice. And how long did you have to do student teaching?
So I did it for a year. And at the end of that year, I then was going to have to do one more semester. And the school that hired me was willing to finish out my time in that.
Okay. And then, so what's the process from there? Do you already have your kind of teaching credential before you do student teaching, or do you get your teaching credential afterwards?
Generally, it's while you are earning your teaching credential.
Okay.
It's done as part of the curriculum.
Got it. Okay. And so what were your next steps after that?
So I was volunteering with middle school youth ministry at the time while I was student teaching and everything else. And I really realized how much I loved middle school, which most people who hear me say that think that I've just completely lost my mind, because it's such a wonky time in a student's life. But I just knew that how much growth came from that time, and the richness and the depth of conversations with students at that age group. And I knew that with my love of writing, I wanted to teach language arts. And so I found a 7th grade middle school language arts teaching position that took a chance on me as a first-year teacher. And I jumped into that in the last 6 months of my credentialing program.
That's great. And I hear that refrain often, that people, I think they either really love middle school or really want to stay away from it.
It's very much a polarizing conversation.
So how was your first year? What was your first year like? Was it exciting, nerve-wracking, scary? All of those?
It was brutal. And actually in my book, I talk a lot about very much in a self-deprecating manner that first year in the middle school classroom, because I'm an optimistic person by nature. I go into situations and circumstances, now tempered obviously with some practical vantage point, but very much idealistic.
Yeah.
And so going in as a first year teacher in a 7th grade classroom, I was too idealistic. Okay. I went in thinking that, you know, I was going to be, my youth was on my side. I was going to be able to relate to these students, and it was all just going to get along in such this perfect manner. And I fell down so many times, and parents doubted me. The students tried to just completely railroad me. It was brutal. It was a time in my life where I thought I had made a catastrophic life choice in becoming a teacher, and how can I get out of this?
Oh, I only laugh because as an educator myself, I can resoundingly identify with that.
Huh. Yeah, it's just, and you have to go through it. I don't think, maybe there's a special case out there or two, and I give them just the highest praise, but I think every first year teacher has to go through, you've got to trudge through it. You got to know it's going to be hard, because on the after side of it, it's so much better, and you are so much better because of the shortcomings of that first year.
Well, and I really think there's a difference between seeing and doing. So you had mentioned as a student teacher, you got to observe a veteran teacher interacting. Oh, that's how they should handle it. That's a really great way. And seeing that or hearing it or reading it in a book is kind of one thing. But when you're there, like you also said, you don't have time to self-reflect. You don't really have a lot of time to weigh, what are these decisions? How do I do this? How do I approach this? And so you have to think so quickly on your feet, and without that experience, that actual legitimate experience, it's almost impossible. And so I think every first year teacher has stumbles. And for me personally, it's more than the first year. Like there's still times where I'm like, oh, why did I do that? I should have done it this way. And without that experience, you can't figure it out. So.
Absolutely. When I interview future teachers for my own staffing needs, we'll talk a lot about that. Like, you could be a 3rd-year teacher, you could be a 30-year veteran of the classroom. It's still not going to always go the way that you want it to. Nope. We're working with kids. They're the most unpredictable population of all. And we have to be so willing to just like lean into those moments and be like, I'm going to try it again tomorrow. And I'm going to show them the resolve that I want to cultivate in the students.
I mean, even just thinking about how the pandemic has transitioned, even if you were a veteran teacher, the pandemic threw you through a whole loop. I feel like the pandemic was actually good for novice teachers because we didn't already have a way of doing things. And so it was easier to transition. So even just life can throw you through a loop.
Absolutely. And I really encourage any teachers who are thinking about giving up after this year, again, novice or veteran, to give it another year. Like, this year doesn't define your passion or your ability to be an effective educator. Like, we need teachers, and we need great ones who love kids to come back in the fall and let's try it again.
And know that we stumbled and we didn't do well, but of course we didn't. It was a pandemic, and nobody's ever experienced one before, so we were just learning.
Well, and we made it. Like, we survived. Like, there's light at the end of the tunnel. We're coming out of it now.
Yeah.
And that's a huge accomplishment in and of itself.
Yeah. Okay. And then I know you mentioned your book, and I really want to get to that in just a minute, but let's go a little bit more linearly first. So after your first year, you survived your first year. How did you transition basically from that to kind of where you are now?
Great question. So after my first year and I made it, I really thought that this was where I was just going to be. I was going to stay at my current school till the end of time, and middle school was my jam. And I really, year after year, was finding my footing more and more. Life threw us a curveball, in 2014. My husband had the opportunity for a job in Dallas.
Okay.
And I had never left the Bay Area. I mentioned I went to school here. So the idea of moving out of the state was just like, I didn't even know what that would look like. And because I was California credentialed, my credentials weren't necessarily transferable immediately to Texas.
Right.
So I left teaching full-time in the end of 2014, that spring, and moved to Texas. and basically had a hiatus from the classroom. I was doing a bit of consulting for my school back here, but I wasn't teaching full time. I had a moment where I really, akin back to being a student teacher, could be self-reflective and start to see the forest through the trees a bit. And so I started just jotting down memories and notes, reflections on lessons that landed really well, or what did I want to change when I went back to teaching eventually. And more so, I started to reflect on the parent-teacher dynamic and how I was so grateful for how my relationships with parents had evolved over my close to 10 years in the middle school classroom. But how did I want to take that and turn it into a larger conversation around reducing the communication chasm that exists between parents and teachers? We're all on the same side. We're working towards the same goals. And so with this time on my hands for about 8 months, and I'll tell you why, I started to flesh out these notes into thoughts and bigger ideas, and they became chapters, and this manuscript was born.
Okay.
But about eight months into my hiatus from teaching full time, my former school called me up. They were in a pinch. A teacher had to take an emergency leave of absence from the 8th grade. And they asked if I would come back and finish out the year, because I knew these kids, I knew the procedures. So I started commuting, it became a big joke on Virgin America on this commuter flight that I was on, because I was in San Francisco during the week. I was in Dallas on the weekends. Everyone was like, oh, there's that teacher again, as I'm commuting with these kind of tech executives. And so for 6 weeks, I commuted back and forth, and I taught and was in Dallas. And at the end of those 6 weeks, my former principal, who was very convincing, was like, well, you've got this routine down now, so you can just come back in the fall.
Oh, no.
Yes. And so my husband and I talked it over. I had started a graduate program for administration, and we were like, you know what? This is working. And I was feeling so fulfilled as a teacher at that point again, because it was hard to not be in the classroom when I was on that hiatus. And so I did. So then I commuted the following year and went back and forth for that, and did graduate work at the same time, and continued on those flights to work on my manuscript.
Wow, that's a lot of commuting.
Definitely.
And did you ever get out of that commuting? I know you're still in the Bay Area right now. So are you still commuting back and forth, or did you end up moving there full time?
No. So then, it was at the end of this, it was time for us to kind of come back to the Bay Area. My husband's time in Texas had wrapped up. And I, at that point, had finished my master's in educational leadership, and a principal position had become available at a school here in San Francisco. And so I interviewed and got it. And so I have been a principal for the last 5 years at a K-8 here in the Mission District of San Francisco.
Wow.
Yeah.
So this segued pretty perfectly into talking about your book. So your book is called The Overly Honest Teacher, right?
Yes.
And so you were working on this manuscript while flying back and forth between Dallas and San Francisco. And you mentioned it's about kind of the dichotomy between like parents and teacher and that relationship?
Primarily, it has a lot of stories and anecdotes that help to kind of, remote learning has done this far more than my book did, but pull back the emerald curtain a bit on what happens between 8 and 3 on the day-to-day. Parents drop their kids off, they pick them up at the end of the school day, but what goes on during that time? So there's moments and points of reflection and conversation around that. But the bigger conversation and the goal was, let's get back on the same team. Let's get back to hitting the reset button in terms of, it's not this turf war between parent and teacher, but rather let's start talking about what are our goals for my student, your child. Where do we want them to go? Where do I see that they're having a difficult time? And how can we partner together to extend the classroom learning environment into the at-home environment so that growth can be far more consistent?
Well, and I think that's a really relevant topic in today's time, because I've heard that one of the leading reasons for teachers leaving the profession is that parent relationship. Is that what you found to be true? Or at least
Definitely.
In some instances?
Yeah, it's interesting when people ask me what's the hardest part of your job, before I have a chance to answer, which is kind of a laundry list of, well, there's this and there's also that. But typically the answer that they answer for themselves is like, it's got to be the parents, right? And in a lot of ways it is, but not by the fault of our parent and guardian community. Just that, again, we haven't fully aligned the fact that we both share the same ideology.
Right.
And I think once you do that and you're able to establish that baseline, so much transformative growth and relationship building comes from it.
Well, and you mentioned the transparency of what happens during that kind of 8 to 3 timeline. Is that one of those contributing factors of where parents were having a difficult time? Is that, I mean, my children are small, so they're still like 4.5, but every time I try to ask him what he did at school, he cannot tell me. I figured out different ways of asking the question where I can usually get like one story, but it's usually something that happened on the playground. And so is it this idea that parents had no idea what was happening, and even asking their children was not illuminating it?
Yes, definitely that, for sure. And I have some strategies in my book in terms of how to foster that communication with your student, especially when they get into middle school. Great. And really just want to like put the wall up. But I think also parents have a mindset of, my child is the best, which absolutely, they're your child. They are the best in your universe, but they're going to be number one. They're going to get the A. What do you mean that they got a C on that essay? Like I helped them write it. I know that it's good. And it's like, okay, well, therein lies the problem. Number one, it's not their voice. But number two, we have to reset the realization that not everyone is going to get a trophy 5 days a week, every game, every paper, every, competition. That there's going to be times where your child comes in second or third, and that's okay. As a teacher, I celebrate. Exactly. Those are the moments for growth and evolution for them. In the long run, as someone who can adapt and be flexible and have a growth mindset. But I think over time, there's been the diminishment of seeing value in silver and bronze. And yes. So I think there has to be a transparency of conversation where the teacher says, look, your child is wonderful, but they didn't hit the benchmark that we know they're capable of this time. And that's okay. Let's talk strategies on how they can do it next time.
Well, and I think one thing that I work really hard with my students, and my students are college age students, and I have to fight so hard for them to understand that not only are they going to slip up and make mistakes and fail, but that it's encouraged, because that's where like real learning and growth takes place, is in those mistakes and in those falters. And my students are so concentrated on getting the A and the top prize and everything. And I totally agree, where we've come to this mindset of that gold is the standard and everybody should achieve that. And trying to convince them that true transformation and learning can actually happen when they don't meet those benchmarks is very difficult. So I can't imagine having to have that conversation with parents as well.
Well, and I think my first year, I went in assuming that was just kind of a given, that parents would have an understanding that their child wasn't going to always be at the top. And so I had to change how I approach these topics. But again, you alluded to something a few minutes ago. It's that transparency. Mm-hmm. Parents want us to speak truthfully to them. And that's where we can really work together. If we're operating under falsehoods or idealism that just isn't relatable to their child, we're never going to get anywhere.
Absolutely. That's been my whole teaching philosophy, essentially, is transparency with the students. Again, I think similarly, I'm kind of talking to parents in that I'm talking to a college-aged student, but just allowing them to see, this is why I created this assignment. This is why you're doing this. Like, a lot of college students think that we just give them busy work for no reason. And they're like, you're just giving me this. You don't even have a reason. And if I tell them, this is the reason, this is why you're doing this, all of a sudden it becomes clear, and that transparency helps them. They're more motivated. They are more willing to do it. They're willing to put in the effort to do it. So that transparency can be pretty transformative.
Yeah, and empowering.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so you worked on this manuscript. Can you walk us through the process of what it's like to write a book, and how is it scary? I know I'm currently like at the very beginning stages of writing. I'm working on a first draft. And so I know from my personal experience, but I'd like to hear from someone else. What's it like actually putting a book out into the world and writing one?
I didn't necessarily set out to write a book. It more so was just, again, kind of these musings that I had because I didn't have a lot else to do. And I was still focused on teaching. So my process was different in terms of I didn't necessarily have like an outline or a framework. It was more that as I wrote down one idea, it evolved into, oh gosh, let's talk about this. And from there, it was like, oh, well, that really plays into this memory or this. So it was very, as I said, a lot organic in terms of it just started to come together. And what I found was I started it in 2014. It wasn't published until 2020. And when I started being a principal, I had to shelve it. Because that job was just so all encompassing. I had no time for, to eat a sandwich, let alone to work on a book. And when I started to be able to come up for air and, kind of was like, I had an experience that I was like, well, that actually would work really well in my book. And then I started to go back and revisit the manuscript. And that time away was huge in terms of, one, shocking at how technology that I referenced in my book had evolved over the course of 5 or 6 years.
Overnight, yeah.
Yes, which when you're talking about the digital age is a lifetime. But two, to see that a lot of the experiences from 2007 when I started teaching were still rearing their heads here in 2020. And so I realized that there's so many universal issues that I don't think necessarily change over time, just the way that we address them changes. But kids are kids and they're going to still face those same issues. So I went a bit away from the writing process, but it partly was just this kind of evolution of thought and idea that came forward into where the manuscript was pretty well done by 2019.
Okay.
And my paths had crossed through I'm currently on the board of the Movement Foundation, and there was a connection in that organization that put me in touch with a publisher who really liked my perspective and my voice, and then brought a team around me to help really clean up the manuscript. You have to be willing to accept criticism and editing when you write a book, because your voice is not necessarily the voice that's going to meet the masses. Right. And you want that outside perspective of an editor to come in and go, we're going to change a few things.
And was that a difficult process going through editing?
It was time consuming. It was arduous in terms of, I don't know how else to say this thought or idea, but I know I need to change it. But I loved it because it really challenged me. Right. As a writer, it challenged me as a thinker. And it challenged me in terms of some humility to be like, oh, I didn't want that sentence or that statement to come across as sharply as it did. And let's work on softening that tone.
I really like that you explained how long it took. So you started it in 2014, you kind of picked it back up. You said it was fully, at least a draft was fully formed, or a manuscript was formed in 2019. And then it still took almost a year, if not a little bit towards that year, to get it fully out there and published. And so just illuminating the fact that it takes that long to write a book is great for listeners.
Definitely. And it's worth it. I mean, you're halfway through the process and it's like, I don't know if it's like, you get to a point where it's trying to squeeze blood from a stone, but once you get past that, you get through the hard stuff, it really becomes just a beautiful thing.
Good. Well, personally, that's good advice to hear, because I am in that squeezing blood from a stone part of mine. I want to transition a little bit from your book to your career as a principal as well, because that's where you've been for the last few years. How does being a principal differ from being a teacher?
In some ways, it's at the complete other end of the spectrum, and in other ways, it's very much the same.
Yeah.
I love the fact that I get to interact with so many students, so many teachers. It's not necessarily impacting just the microcosm of my own individual classroom, but the collaboration that comes from getting to work with my kindergarten teacher up through my 8th grade teacher. I love that. I love getting to develop relationships with the youngest students on campus and the oldest students on campus. I didn't have that before. You'd work recess as a teacher, but not really building those relationships. I love getting to know my parents on such a deep level and really getting to understand what drives them, why did they choose our school, what are their aspirations for their child, and how can we as an organization and an institution support them. The thing, though, I do miss the most is getting to impact that microcosm of my classroom on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. I miss my happiest days sometimes are the ones where I get to substitute, because just getting to have that conversation and banter and do some grammar lessons and work with students on honing their voice, I do definitely miss that. And my advice to anybody who is thinking about going into administration, I always say, hit your point where you are fulfilled as a teacher. Because if you leave the classroom too early, you can always go back, but it really does create a deeper pining for that teacher experience.
Yeah. Well, great. And then essentially kind of my question, my last big tricky question, I guess, is if you have kind of one big piece of advice for somebody wanting to get into a career, and you have had multiple, being a teacher, a principal, a writer, is there like one piece of advice that you think would be good across all those disciplines in terms of like career advice?
I think number one is to not think that just because you pivot away from one career aspiration, that it won't circle back and still impact you later on. I mean, I set out of college wanting to be a writer, and here I am 20 years later, and I'm a teacher, but I'm also a writer. Right. So I think more so it's about embracing kind of where life charts your course, and still realizing that you can take the talents and aspirations that you had from before and bring them into your current reality, no matter what that reality looks like. But specifically, if anybody wants to get into education, I wholeheartedly encourage it, because it is just, there's never a dull moment. It is a constantly changing landscape, and it really is, it's a beautiful life that comes from it.
And do you have advice for people that want to get into education, but sometimes I see students who want to do education and they are struggling with, what age group do I want to work with and want to teach? Do you have advice on how to find that age group that somebody might be interested in working with?
I think by volunteering is a great way. A number of schools look for volunteers for like their after school program, for example, where you can intersect with students of a variety of ages. And just in those moments of having a conversation with a student about soccer or Foursquare or helping them with their math homework, you can start to understand, like, I really love the dialogue that comes from talking with an adolescent, because they're starting to really form their opinions and their ideas. Or I love just the innocence that comes from a kindergartner who's just learning how to count. And I really love coaching them in that. So I think by volunteering, it's a great way, or starting a program and seeing if you can do student teaching, maybe one quarter in one grade area and another quarter in another. I think that those are really important, to have kind of that real life interaction with students of those ages, to know if that's where you're going to find fulfillment.
Yeah, I did my PhD in developmental psychology, and I didn't originally come from developmental. I came from like a whole different area, and I didn't know I wanted to work with kids until I got a summer job once that was working with kids with autism and teaching them language arts, basically how to read, how to comprehend. And I was so nervous. I was like, I've never worked with kids. What if I'm not even good with children? Like, I don't know how to do this. And I fell in love. Like, it was so much fun. They were such great little students, and teaching, like, I already knew I wanted to be a teacher, so it was so much fun. So I went into developmental psychology, and I got to kind of try the different age groups. And I found my favorite is like that 8 to 10 group, because the conversations they can have are wild. Because just like you're saying with adolescents, where they're starting to find their voice a little bit, this is where they're starting to like have more real conversations, and it's a lot of fun.
8 to 10 is fun too, because they're not afraid to be goofy or silly, right? They don't have necessarily the social awareness yet, where they're just willing to have fun.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I agree. Ultimately, I settled on college students. So very different, but very much the same. I notice when I'm researching anything for teaching and learning, I always go through like K through 12 education first, because tried and true, you've already done all of it.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much. So we can find your book, The Overly Honest Teacher. Where else can people find you if they wanted to get more information or to order your book?
Absolutely. I have a website, overlyhonestteacher.com. I keep a blog there. You also will find links to get my book on Amazon or bookshop.org or Barnes & Noble. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. There's lots of ways to get a hold of me. But yeah, Overly Honest Teacher. That's my moniker.
Great. And as always, we'll put it in our social media and show notes and all of that.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Career Journey Podcast. Head over to our website at careerjourneypodcast.com for more information and the latest episodes. See you next time.